Okay. All right. So welcome everyone. Um, we are going to talk today about exposure and response prevention, or ERP, if you've heard of that. My name is Maya Schonbach. I am a clinical psychologist and the clinical program director here at Stop OCD. Um, I think today is a really great webinar. It really is the core of OCD treatment, and I think it's very important for us to talk about the basics, talk about some practical skills, some case examples together. The webinar today, we have about 45 minutes, an hour altogether. And that includes a Q&A at the end. So really, I want to encourage you guys to write into the chat. Anytime you have a question that pops up into your mind, write it in, or if you want to save it to the end, you can also do that. And we'll go through them all together at the end in the Q&A. And then also, I encourage you to stick around because we'll have a promo code at the end of the presentation for a discount to subscribing to our program. So definitely stick around for that. So without further ado, let's get started. So this is what we're gonna cover today. We're gonna talk a little bit about what is OCD. Again, just a brief overview so that we're all kind of on the same page. OCD is a huge topic, so we'll just get into the basics, the bare bones of it. We'll get into what is ERP, why ERP, why is ERP effective? And then we'll talk about some important ingredients that you need in order to build effective exposures. Then we'll go through one case example. We could probably go through a million. It's always interesting dissecting them and learning together. But we'll go through one together. We'll go through some key takeaways, and then do our Q&A. Okay, so let's start with what is OCD. So O in OCD, I like to break it down in terms of the actual OCD. So O, it is obsessions. So these aren't just regular worries, okay? They're intrusive thoughts. They could not, and they're not necessarily just thoughts. They could also be images that pop up into your head, worries. They feel disturbing. They feel irrational. They're frightening, and they pop up extremely suddenly, and they feel extremely hard to ignore. So for some people, it could be maybe a fear of hurting someone that they love. For others, it could be a thought like, what if I left the stove on, even though they know they didn't cook? So these are examples from something, for example, in harm OCD. And really what's important to know is, we're going to talk about this again and again, is that these thoughts are not dangerous or intentional. They just happen, they pop up into your head. And what's key is that everyone gets intrusive thoughts sometimes. I get intrusive thoughts, our friends, our family, everyone does. But the key difference in OCD is that they tend to stick. That's what we call. They feel meaningful, they feel powerful, intentional, and they trigger a huge amount of anxiety. That really is key differences here. Okay, the C in OCD. So C stands for compulsions. So these are the things that someone does to try to feel better in order to reduce the anxiety that is caused by the obsession. So compulsions can be actions. There's different types. So they could be behavioral compulsions. Things like checking that everything is done. Did I close the stove? Did I turn it off? Check again, and often ritualistic in a certain manner. Did I close the knob like this 3 times, 3 times the other way? Cleaning, very common one. Reassurance seeking is something that is also very common, where you ask people around you, are you sure I closed the stove? Did you check the stove that I turned it off? Or they can also be mental compulsions. These are typically harder to actually notice and to feel, um, that you're actually doing them. So that when working with clients, this is, it's harder to know because it's not overt. We call them covert compulsions because they're happening in your head. So that it can be things like mentally repeating a phrase to yourself, a prayer, a mantra, something like that, mentally checking, maybe imagining it, or canceling out a bad thought. So, for example, if I have a bad image pop up of a family member being in a terrible accident, then feeling the intense urge and desire, and then doing the mental compulsion of bringing up into mind something really good happening to that person. So, say imagining somebody being in a car accident, then imagining them winning the lottery, for example. So that's a example of a mental compulsion. And really, a key thing here is that these compulsions, they they bring about some sense of relief, and this relief is real. But the issue is that this relief is short-lived. And that really is the trap here, because the brain learns that it needs to do a compulsion in order to bring down the distress. And then the anxiety comes back, the anxiety or the distress comes back even stronger next time. And it happens again and again and again. And it's a vicious cycle, and we'll talk about this cycle soon. The D in OCD, it's a disorder. So this is also really important to say because I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but people use the term OCD a lot in lay jargon. I'm a little OCD. I'm a little, I don't like this. Really, it's a medical condition. It happens when the cycle of the obsessions and the compulsions take up such a great deal of time, limits a person's freedom, gets in the way really of how they want to live. And it's not, again, it's not about being a little bit anxious or being a clean freak. I'm a little bit OCD. No, no. It really is a medical condition. It's not a personality trait. And here are some of the points that I wrote, or some of the criteria for the diagnosis. That often it's called to be ego dystonic. It's that they recognize that their fears are not are exaggerated. They don't align with who they truly are inside. And often people try to resist doing the compulsions, but because their anxiety is so great, they're unable to resist it. But here, the good news is, yes, it's a medical condition, but it's also treatable. And that's where ERP comes in. ERP really, exposure and response prevention, is the key tool to helping. It's at the heart of OCD treatment, and it's really can help people with OCD reclaim their time, their confidence, their lives. Okay, so let's briefly go over the vicious cycle in OCD. So, typically things start with a trigger. And a trigger then brings about an intrusive thought. And like I said, the thoughts themselves, they're not the problem. What really makes the difference in OCD is how we interpret these thoughts. So it's the interpretation of the thoughts as seeing them as either dangerous or meaningful or threatening, instead of what we like to say, the random white noise of the brain. Because we have thousands of thoughts a day. Scientists have estimated this. And everybody has intrusive thoughts sometimes. And so this interpretation of the thought as dangerous or harmful triggers feelings of distress or danger or anxiety. And then this often activates like our fight or flight response. And then it creates the strong urge to make the discomfort go away. And that's where compulsions come in to bring about some short-term relief. But this is really detrimental because it prevents our brain from learning two really important things. We'll talk about again, that these intrusive thoughts, they're unrealistic, and that you can actually tolerate the distress. And so the cycle repeats itself again and again. That's why we call it a vicious cycle, and it keeps it firmly in place. Let's go through a really quick example. So maybe your trigger could be seeing a knife on the kitchen counter, and then the intrusive thought would be, what if I harm my child? And then the interpretation, again, that's the key thing, is thinking, what if I harm my child, might actually make me do it. So the connection between thinking something and actually carrying out the action. That's the interpretation there. And then that brings about, obviously, very naturally, panic, anxiety, fear, horrible, horrible thought. If that was real, everyone would feel that. And then a compulsion could be tapping the knife, maybe imagining, like I said, it could be mental, it could be imagining good things happening to my child, and then the anxiety and the fear subsides, and then it would just happen again and again and again because triggers are unavoidable. Okay, so now, I like to give this metaphor for OCD is that about drowning in quicksand. So imagine, not drowning, but being stuck. So imagine that you're stuck in quicksand. What happens is your instincts kick in. You begin to feel panic. You start to thrash around trying to escape. But the issue is that the more that you're struggling, the deeper you sink in. And the maybe surprising way to get out of it is that you stop fighting, you lean back slowly, you spread out your weight, and you begin to slowly move towards the shore. And that's really what helps you stay afloat and eventually get free. And OCD really works the same way. The more you fight your intrusive thoughts, your obsessions, and the more you try to escape them and escape the distress caused by them by doing compulsions, the more stuck in the OCD vicious cycle that you get. And really, what helps is doing the opposite. It's leaning into it, letting the thoughts, letting the obsessions, the obsessional thoughts, intrusive thoughts be there without reacting. And that's really what exposure and response prevention, or ERP, helps you practice. Okay, so what is ERP? So ERP stands for exposure and response prevention. And very simply, it's about facing your fears instead of avoiding them. Okay. That's the exposure part. That's that part. And then the response prevention is while you face your fears, you don't do the compulsions that you usually rely on in order to feel better. So at first, this is very important to say, I'm saying it right off at the beginning, your anxiety will likely rise. It'll likely go up and maybe even more than normal. And that's completely normal because you're doing something very scary. And I'm not saying this in a minimizing way. It's something very scary. You sit with clients who are doing things that they could never imagine them doing. And their anxiety peaks. But the key thing is that your brain over time starts to learn two important things. Is that the fear isn't actually as dangerous as it feels. And second of all, that they can handle the anxiety without doing the compulsions, without needing the rituals. And again, like most things, like most skills that you need to learn, it's that you need to practice it. The more you practice, the better your brain rewires itself and the easier it becomes. So at the end of the day, it's a skill that needs to be practiced. Okay, so when we talk about exposure in ERP, it's easy to focus only on the trigger. So for example, the knife, or maybe touching a doorknob or seeing a certain image. But what you're actually exposing yourself to, it's deeper than just this trigger. You're actually exposing yourself to and facing the emotion or an underlying feared outcome that the trigger brings up. So in order to understand what your feared outcome is to ask yourself, what am I really afraid might happen? And then continue with that. We call it the downward arrow. It's, and then what? And then what? And then what? So sometimes the answer could be something very specific, like I'll hurt someone, But other times it could be more emotional. It could be something like I'll feel unbearable guilt, or I'll never be sure, I'll never be certain. That's also something very, very common with OCD. We say it's a very strong difficulty tolerating uncertainty. And so really the target of the exposure isn't the knife or a doorknob. It's the feeling that you're trying to avoid. So we're trying to expose ourselves to that feeling. So to the fear, to the shame, to the uncertainty, or to the doubt. And then by staying with that emotion without escaping through compulsions, again, that's key. That's the response prevention part. You teach your brain the powerful thing that you can withstand the discomfort and nothing terrible happens. And again, that's the real work of ERP that happens gradually over time. So let's go through a simple example of ERP before we continue. So maybe a trigger could be touching a public door handle that brings up the intrusive thought, what if I get sick? Then the feared outcome could be, I'll make my kids sick and it'll be my fault. And for some people, this fear could go even further. They could imagine the worst. Like I'm saying, you could go through the downward arrow and say, and what then. And they imagine the worst. They say, what if they die because of me? And that's really the emotional weight that we're working with in ERP. That's why I'm saying I'm not minimizing this by saying it's scary. It is truly, truly terrifying to face these fears. And that's why we do it very gradually, one step at a time. And that's what's so challenging, but also powerful with ERP. And so normally when you face the intrusive thought, this leads to the desire to do the compulsion of repeated, say, washing your hands. But then in ERP, what you're going to do is you're going to actually practice touching the door handle, but skip hand washing. And then, like I said, it has to be gradual. So if skipping hand washing completely is too distressing, then you can delay it for X amount of time that you set in advance. So say 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And then the anxiety will rise. It always does. But as you sit with it, the distress fades naturally. That's how your brain learns that danger isn't real. That's what happens in our brain if you don't do the compulsions. And that's very important. Okay, now let's get into why ERP. And just a reminder to write into the chat about any questions. Okay, so this is the OCD anxiety curve. So you'll see how your compulsions affect your anxiety or your distress over time. So time is the x-axis. I read on the y-axis SUDS, which it means subjective units of distress. Really all it means is distress that you rank from 1 to 10, 10 being the most distress you've ever felt, 1 being the least amount, and how anxiety from 1 to 10. So basically what happens is that each time an intrusive thought shows up, your distress rises. And then in order to get some relief, you engage in a compulsion. And that's why the distress drops, because the compulsion works. It really does for a brief amount of time. It reduces your anxiety, but it's very short-lived. And then the anxiety returns as soon as the next thought comes up. And that's why you can see it. And then over time, this creates the cycle where you feel like you have to repeat the compulsion again and again and again just to manage this rising distress. Okay, so now let's look at the ERP green curve. So when you face your intrusive thoughts without doing compulsions, this is what ERP is. Your anxiety rises at first. And see, in the green line, it actually rises even higher than the purple line. Hang on, I just want to see. Okay. So this part really, really is hard, that the fact that the anxiety is going up so much. And this is what's really challenging about ERP is that your anxiety and distress is going so high, but you have to stay with this discomfort instead of escaping it. And the thing is that over time, as you continue to stay with it, the distress naturally starts to go down. And it takes longer. That's how you see it takes longer on the x-axis, on the time axis, but it does go down. And that's, again, how your brain learns the newer, healthier pattern. And then here you can see, as you repeat these exposures again and again without doing compulsions, your anxiety eventually decreases. And this is something called habituation. And all that means is that it's your body learning to adjust to the discomfort. So I kind of like to use the analogy of how your eyes adjust to the darkness when you walk into a dark room. So initially it's completely dark and you can't see anything. And then over time, your eyes start to adjust and you can make out some figures and some shapes. So like that, in ERP, over time, the same trigger starts to feel less overwhelming. And it is truly incredible the change that people are able to do with ERP. Okay, so again, I really can't hammer this home enough, is what your brain learns in ERP is even more important than getting used to than having your anxiety go down to zero, or not zero, but reduce, is what your brain is learning. So first, your brain starts to recognize that these intrusive thoughts are exaggerated, they feel real, but they're not dangerous. And then second, really you prove to yourself that you are able to handle difficult emotions like fear, uncertainty, shame, that they feel intense, but they don't control you and they aren't harmful. Again, that's really the power of ERP, is that you're basically retraining your brain to see the situation in a more accurate way. Okay, so now let's go through some key steps to build effective exposures and in ERP. So ERP begins with building your exposure hierarchy. So all that really means is starting by writing down your intrusive thoughts and the situations or objects or things that trigger your anxiety or compulsions. Now, it's important to try to be specific. That is very important. The next thing is you want to rate each one based on how distressing it feels. Again, using the subjective units of distress scale, 1 being low, 10 being high. And then once you've done that, you're going to look at your whole list and you're going to want to select a trigger in the middle range, something that feels uncomfortable. It does trigger distress, but it's doable. So we usually recommend starting with something that you've rated around 4 to 6. So again, something that's not too easy, but also not too overwhelming. So just enough to start practicing. And then this exposure hierarchy becomes kind of like your roadmap for your whole ERP journey. And again, you can go back and modify and change and update and everything. But this is really like the starting point. Okay, so once you've chosen a trigger to work on, then you need to plan the exposure. So this is also very important because you don't want to wait for your anxiety to show up and then react to the anxiety by doing the exposure, because that's kind of like turning this into another compulsion, right? Like you don't want to react, you want to do it in a very methodical, planned out ahead of time way. So instead, you're going to schedule your exposures ahead of time. So we want you to choose a specific time, a specific place, and really try to think through exactly what you're going to need, whether it's a certain item, a certain place, even a support person. So for example, if it's with a knife and it's a fear of hurting someone in your family, maybe your partner, you might need to do an exposure with having your partner stand with you in the kitchen. So you'll need to make sure that your partner is available. They seem very trivial things, but if you're going to plan this ahead of time and you're going to do this methodically, it's important to make sure these people are available. And then to also try to anticipate potential challenges, what might get in the way. Can you maybe set up your environment to help yourself follow through, to maybe at the beginning, maybe to try and make your compulsions less available. Again, try to make sure that the exposure is doable, but not overwhelming. And then finally, I recommend writing the plan down, because really writing a concrete plan, it makes it much more likely that you're going to complete the exposure, even when it's really hard. And these are really, really hard things to do. Okay, so for an exposure to really help with OCD, a few key ingredients need to be kind of in place. So they need to be prolonged, they need to be repeated, they need to cause some distress, and they need to end with a learning experience. So let's go through these. So first, exposures need to be prolonged, because you need to be able to stay in a situation long enough in order to fully face your fear, in order to fully have the distress rise, in order to sit with it and to feel it going down. It needs to give you enough time to explore the feared outcome instead of escaping or basically using compulsions in order to feel safer. You really need to allow the anxiety and the uncertainty to be there without trying to push them away. And like I said, often the anxiety, when you allow it to be there, it fades on its own. But like I said, that's not the goal that we're chasing. The goal here is to learn that the anxiety and the distress is tolerable. Next, the exposure needs to be repeated. So your brain has already built really strong links between fear and danger, and the compulsions reducing that fear and danger. And between the intrusive thought and the feared outcome, right? And also the interpretation of the intrusive thought. So you need to repeat your exposures in order to create new, safer learning, in order to create new wiring between your brain and to understand that it is not dangerous to feel these emotions. And then with repetition, you give your brain these new experiences where nothing bad happens. And then over time, these kind of healthier connections take hold and your brain forms these new, healthier wiring. So exposures should bring up some distress, but again, like I said, not too much that it overwhelms you. So you want enough anxiety to activate the fear that you're actually working on, but again, at a level that you can handle. So that's why we say that ERP is gradual. You begin with easier situations, and then you slowly, slowly work your way up as your confidence grows. You're not going to jump in and go to a 9 or a 10 trigger. That's not going to be helpful, and it's just going to kind of stop the practice very early. And you don't want to start with a 1 or a 2, because then you're not going to get a feeling of success from practicing that exposure. So we want to do between a 4 and a 6 on the distress scale. And then, like I said, the real purpose of exposure is the learning that happens while you're staying with the distress. So first, you're going to see that the feared outcome, it doesn't happen. It's not going to happen while you're doing this exposure. And second, you're going to prove to yourself that you can handle the emotions, even when they feel extremely intense, and without doing the compulsions. And so, like I said, distress usually for most people naturally drops over time. And if you want a number, we say typically around 50%. That's kind of like a benchmark. If you rated it at an 8, it'll drop to a 4. If you rated it at a 4, it'll drop to a 2. But even if anxiety doesn't drop the full 50%, that's okay, because like I said, the real goal isn't to eliminate the anxiety, it's to learn that you could tolerate these emotions without needing the compulsions. All right, let's go through a case example now. Okay, so Daniel is a 31-year-old graphic designer. He started having intense thoughts while driving. He started thinking things like, what if I hit someone and didn't realize it? And even without any real danger while he was driving, the thoughts triggered intense feelings of guilt, a lot of panic. And then in order to feel safe, he'd check his mirrors repeatedly. He retraced his drive, and he continued checking the news after he got home to see if there were any reports of accidents. And over time, short drives became longer. They became anxiety-filled rituals. And then he started also avoiding certain roads entirely. So Daniel started by listing his driving related triggers and then rating them based on how distressing they felt on the scale from 1 to 10, or here or 0 to 10. And really this hierarchy gives Daniel a clear kind of structure to work through, like I said, gradually. So you start with low to moderate distress and then move up only when ready. So he started by saying that driving on an empty but unfamiliar street was rated at a 2. If he knew it was empty, there weren't any pedestrians around. But driving near pedestrians, that was pretty high. He rated it at a 5. Driving over bumps that he felt that his brain started thinking, maybe it's a person, maybe I hit someone, at a 6. Driving past a school, at an 8, driving in the dark at a 9. And so this was his exposure hierarchy. So again, like I said, it's important to not wait for a moment of panic. So Daniel planned his ERP in advance. So he scheduled a specific time during his lunch break to drive past a busy sidewalk near his office. Again, like I said, it has to be very specific, not too broad. Plan it in advance. And he actually told a friend that what he was going to do that exposure that day for accountability. And he wrote exactly what he was going to practice. So he's going to drive the route without checking his mirrors or without turning around. And then he was going to sit with the anxiety for 20 minutes afterwards without asking for reassurance also. And then he also planned a short break afterwards to reflect and to track how his distress changed throughout the whole exposure. So including the driving, including the waiting after, and just to sit with all of it. So at first, like we said, Daniel's anxiety was extremely high. He felt a strong urge to pull over, to double check his route. But he followed the plan. He stayed with the uncertainty, stayed with the anxiety, and he didn't check. And then he repeated this exposure every day for a week. Initially, his anxiety rose, but he reminded himself that the goal isn't to have zero anxiety, but it's really to teach his brain that he can withstand the distress, withstand the uncertainty. So doing this, he was able to push through. And then by the end of the week, after practicing it again and again, doing the same route, his anxiety dropped. He did notice that it dropped by about 50%. And then once that felt manageable, he moved on to the next trigger, driving over bumps without looping back. So really the hardest part for Daniel was tolerating the uncertainty, tolerating that lingering voice that said, what if I actually hurt somebody? What if I didn't notice? What if I really hit somebody? But with each exposure, he was able to stay present and let the fear be there without acting on it, without doing the compulsions. And then in doing that, he learned, his brain understood, he internalized that the anxiety fades and that he could handle these intense feelings and these intense intrusive thoughts without needing to check. And really, that's the kind of progress that ERP is designed to create. Okay, so we only went through one case example, but if you have any questions, again, write them into the chat. But let's wrap up with kind of the most important things to remember from this presentation. So first, OCD works like a cycle. Intrusive thoughts are interpreted in a meaningful, threatening way that leads to distress. Compulsions provide then short-term relief, and then they actually reinforce the OCD and keep the cycle going. And ERP is something that comes and helps break that cycle by doing really the opposite. It helps you face your fear, resist the urge to engage in compulsions. And when you do that, your brain learns this fear isn't dangerous as it feels. And I don't need to do the ritual or the compulsion in order to be okay. So for ERP to work, there's some key ingredients. So first of all, the exposure needs to be planned, not done in the heat of the moment. And then it should also be prolonged, that it is long enough for the learning to actually happen. It needs to be repeated often enough for the habituation to happen. It should bring up some level of distress, but not overwhelm you. And it needs to end with the learning experience of the understanding that this is our goal, not the zero anxiety. And then really key is to start with small steps. Don't jump to the high triggers. Start with small, even baby steps. Tracking your progress, that's really key. And then to remember that this is something that you need to practice. It's a skill. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And then again, something that I really want to remind everyone is that you're not alone with this and that change is absolutely possible. So I just want to say I put up here some of our free resources from Stop OCD. So first of all, our website is stopocd.com. And we have free webinars such as this one, and we have recordings of our past webinars that you can check out on our YouTube page, stopocd.com. And then finally, I really recommend following us on social media because on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, they really are really good opportunities for community, for other comprehensive centers, for information and for treatment options. So definitely follow us there. And like I said, here's the promo code for a discount of $100 for joining our program for the first month using ProWeb100. And if you have any technical questions about the program, definitely send an email to support@stopocd.com. And if you have anything maybe more clinical or private that you don't feel like asking now in the Q&A, send me an email to maya@helpingminds.com. All right, so let's get into the Q&A. Okay, so the first question is, how come ERP seems to make OCD compulsions worse? How long does it take to get better if we do ERP? Okay, so the first question, sorry, there's an ambulance going by, if you can hear it, can be a trigger. So how come ERP seems to make the OCD compulsions worse? So it's like I said, if we go back to the, how do I go there quickly? The anxiety curve, the ERP and the OCD anxiety curve, that's really the issue. Because why do we do compulsions? We do compulsions in order when our anxiety or our distress increases. And what happens when you're doing ERP is that you're facing your fears head on. So your distress level actually goes up even higher than you normally would when you were just kind of minding your own business and just letting the OCD run the take hold of the reins. So here you're actually going against the OCD, you're facing your fear head on, and so your distress level is going way up. It's higher than it would be when you're just doing normal your everyday compulsions. So it makes sense that you would want to do more compulsions. But that's where the RP part of the ERP comes in, is that you're not going to do your compulsions when you're doing ERP. So if your compulsions are getting worse, then you're not actually doing ERP. You're maybe doing the exposure without the response prevention, but the response prevention is key. But it makes sense that the distress goes up. And then how long does it take to get better if we do ERP? It's such a good question because but it's so hard to answer because it's so individual. I can tell you that with certain clients, certain triggers are, they practice them a few times and they can move on. And then with other clients, they're working on the same triggers for weeks at a time. So again, it totally depends on what you mean by getting better and how intense the OCD is, how intense the distress is. So it depends. I know that's an annoying answer. Another question. So do you have any suggestions for supporting a spouse or loved one struggling with OCD? So that is a fantastic question. Yes. So one of the biggest things about family members or loved ones with OCD is something called accommodation. I think we're actually going to do a webinar all on this soon, so definitely look out for that because it's such a common thing. But in essence, accommodation is when loved ones help the person doing the with OCD do their compulsion. So, for example, if the compulsion could be is reassurance seeking, then and I'm the loved one, then I would answer them. So if the obsession would be if it's the intrusive thoughts and the obsessions are about, did I turn the stove off? And I'm at home, I would say, yes, don't worry, you turn the stove off. And that's because I love them. I want to help them. I want their anxiety to go down. I don't want them to feel distressed all the time. But really, what that is doing is actually helping sustain the OCD cycle. And so, a really big thing that loved ones can do is to say firmly and lovingly, no, I'm not going to cooperate with your OCD and I'm not going to accommodate your compulsions and accommodate your OCD anymore. And to really set your own boundaries. And that's what's really important as loved ones, is in order to make sure that your own needs aren't, because it can be, it's not only the time and the distress of that one person, it influences the whole family. So that's definitely something that I would suggest. How is OCD with scrupulosity going to help? So there is definitely a whole kind of subtype of OCD all about morality. Yeah, so I would look into morality OCD. Do you have any specific questions? Are you asking about ERP, how you can do exposures? Because you're right, you can't face the fear of dying and then going to hell or going to heaven. But you have to look at the core fear and test things that you can actually look at in your day-to-day life. That's my view on that. Can compulsion in the absence of obsessive thought fulfill a diagnosis of OCD? Okay, that's very interesting because there is something called pure O, which is pure obsessions. which is literally the opposite of what you're asking. So just the obsessions without the compulsions. I I don't it's hard for me to say. Even pure O, there's a lot of debate in the literature, the academic literature, about whether or not that is actually a thing, because typically there is a compulsion that is there to reduce the obsession and reduce the anxiety. Likewise here, if you're saying if it's just a compulsion in the absence of an obsessive thought, why are you doing the compulsion then? The compulsion is done, is performed in order to reduce some distress. And the distress comes about by some obsession. So I would I would challenge you here to really follow it through. If the compulsion is just a feeling, there is also something called just right OCD, in which it could just be the feeling, the need for symmetry, for example. So if it's the compulsion could be just straightening things, making sure they're completely symmetrical, things like that. It could be because of the obsessional thought that something doesn't sit just right. And if I don't, and I feel distress when it's sitting just as it is. So then I do the compulsion in order to relieve some of that distress. So um I guess I'm kind of answering your question with a challenge to follow it through and to try and find the underlying, why is the compulsion? Why are you performing that compulsion? What is the distress coming from? To kind of follow it back. Okay. If OCD is caused by trauma, for example, sexual abuse, is it compulsory to treat the trauma first using EMDR, for example, then followed by ERP? That's a really good question. I would say it depends, because often things are layered, and things need to be managed, I don't know, sequentially. But it is very important for, if the trauma is interfering with the client's ability to actually face the fear and not do the compulsions, if it interferes with their ability to do ERP, then I would treat the trauma first. And like you said, EMDR definitely is the gold standard of treatment for trauma therapy. So because it's very difficult, I would suggest something like that, sitting with a face-to-face professional. Face-to-face could be on Zoom also, um, but not through just like a webinar or something like that. It definitely is more complicated when you add in trauma and OCD. Great question. So when you are in recovery from OCD, I also like that you say in recovery, because it is something that you need to um, manage and cope with. Do the intrusive thoughts still feel as serious, or are they a lot calmer? Um, so I think I like what you said. So do they feel as serious? So it could be the key learning here, like we said with ERP, is that the interpretation. So your brain is learning that these intrusive thoughts will arise, because they pop up into their heads. I have intrusive thoughts, and I don't have OCD. I'll be driving the car and all of a sudden I could have an intrusive thought about pulling the car into the side bank, but I don't have OCD, because I know that this is just random white noise in my brain. I don't know why that just popped into my head. I go like this maybe, and it's distressing, but it subsides. And I don't have to do a compulsion to reduce that anxiety, because I know it'll subside. So it could, so typically they feel less serious. That is a really good way of phrasing that. Um, and if you're asking about frequency, typically they are less frequent, but they still arise. And I think that's a big key learning principle here. Does your program combine cognitive behavioral therapy with ERP, or combine CBT with ERP? So yes, ERP is a fundamental tool of CBT, of cognitive behavioral therapy treatment for OCD. And that definitely is the CBT. It's based off of CBT and evidence-based techniques that we use in our Stop OCD. And if you have any other questions about our program, definitely don't hesitate to ask. Another question. So my son asks me reassurance questions all the time with things like turn the stove off. It makes me want to check though too. How would a loved one draw that line? I think it's really important to, first of all, understand with yourself why you're doing it. So to understand how OCD works, and coming to webinars like this is very important, because to feel sturdy and strong with what you're saying and what boundary you're setting. And so I would say, I love you, but we, first of all, do a conversation that it's going to happen, that you're going to start not answering as reassurance. But it also needs to be something that comes from them. Like it needs to be done in a conversation that you're gonna have to, that you're going to be stopping giving reassurance. Because otherwise it creates an intense amount of distress. And so how would you draw that line? I would say something like, I love you, but I'm not going to cooperate with your OCD right now. So that's a form, you could do a form of externalization saying this is your OCD right now. And I'm not going to check about your whether the stove is off. I know it's really uncomfortable. I know it's really distressing. But I believe in you that you can tolerate the distress. And then just leave it at that, and then just continue with what you were doing before. Another question, is there a software application to generate the time sides graphs? No, but in our program, we have a tool that helps you track your ERP practice. So that is really beneficial in order to track it, to monitor it. It shows your distress levels, but it's not these specifically. What makes OCD long lasting and chronic if in a way you can rewire the brain? So OCD is long lasting and chronic because it's so distressing and that it's so difficult to do this treatment. So that's what I said at the beginning. Remember, it's a medical condition. It really is a diagnosable condition. But you can always rewire the brain. That's what learning is. It's something called neuroplasticity. Our brain, the wiring changes all the time. Whenever we're learning new things, whenever we're practicing new skills. So that is definitely a benefit of our brain. But OCD is long lasting and chronic because it's something that needs to be practiced. Can you can you get rid of it completely? I I'm I don't want to promise that ever. I never promise that to clients. I say it's something that we're going to manage and you're going to learn to cope with. You're going to learn skills to cope with it. Can tapering a compulsion help initially with harder tasks like showering or driving, just to slowly let the brain learn that it takes 3 counts instead of 10 counts, for example? Yes, you can. That is a great way. So like I said in one of the slides, I'm not going to look for it now, but we said either to stop the compulsion, or if that feels too hard, to delay the compulsion, or also I didn't include, but modify the compulsion. So that's a great way. So yeah, so either to taper it, so instead of 10 counts, 3 counts, 1 count, no counts, or to change the order. So kind of do the compulsion wrong. So often it would be like, I need to wash my hands in this specific way. Do A, B, C, do C, A, B. Like change up the order. That's also a way to kind of like mess around if it feels too hard to prevent the compulsion completely. So great, great point. Can health anxiety be OCD or can it be rational? And I'll combine it with this question. Also, can health anxiety be treated with ERP, and how caregivers at home help with that without accommodation? So really great question. So yes, health anxiety, again, it really depends on what the health anxiety is, but it definitely can be in the realm of OCD. Um, and it also can, I mean, be rational. That's again the point is, if it causes enough distress, if it's interfering enough with your life, that's how you get a diagnosis of a disorder. And how can caregivers at home help with that without accommodation? So I would think here it would be a lot of the reassurance seeking, maybe the checking of websites, of articles, looking up things on WebMD. So I again have a conversation, like I said before, with modeling about with the other question about accommodation, and definitely have a conversation first and talk about how this is something that's reinforcing the vicious cycle, and that you're going to do it with love, but we're going to set boundaries, because it's also for yourself and also for them. And that you're going to say, I love you, but I'm not going to cooperate with your OCD. And then you're going to set your boundary of not giving reassurance. Another comment, I would also say to the rewire the brain question that OCD can morph and change in the obsessions you have. Very true. You could start with counting and move to thoughts of harm, so your brain would need to be trained to the things it morphs to. Very good point, is that OCD is dynamic, it changes all the time. And I think that's also why it can be so chronic and long lasting. And that's why we say that these are skills that you learn and that you can apply them to a whole wide variety of areas. All right, so we're out of time, but I want to thank you all so much for attending, and the recording will be on our YouTube channel shortly. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.